This is part 6 of Dawson, a series on the evolution of a fictional New England mill city utilizing real history. Last episode, we talked about the first waves of French-Canadian immigration, the boom of the triple-deckers, and the first public transportation solution. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend doing so. If you already have or just like to listen out of order, then welcome to the show. This is Dawson. I remember as a kid, one of the things I would look forward to every year was the Greek festival in Lewiston. It was, well, still is, a festival that the Greek Orthodox Church does. When I look at the history of these mill cities, Greek immigrants aren't in the limelight like Irish, French-Canadian, and other future immigrants are. But it's the little things like the Greek festival that remind me about these people. As if it was saying, hey, we still exist. Don't forget about us. Here's an excerpt from the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church's About page on their website. Quote, Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in Lewiston, Maine was founded in 1910. As a small church on Lincoln Street in downtown Lewiston, it was established to serve more than 3,000 Greeks in the community who were drawn to the area by jobs in the Bates and surrounding mills. As the mills began to close in the 1950s, the Greek residents migrated south to the Massachusetts mills, and the population of Holy Trinity reduced significantly. With only 135 families in 1967, one priest, Father Sotieros Alexopoulos, transformed the parish and revitalized it during this difficult transition. The community built a new church in 1977 to fulfill the growing needs of the community. Despite the drop in population, the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church was known as a pillar of civic leadership in Lewiston and Auburn, Maine. But by 2000, the community's population was at a low of fewer than 90 families. End quote. I admire the strength that this small communities like these guys have. It's the same story for other communities as well. In the last couple decades of Dawson, the population reached 35,000. By 1880, the population reached 35,000 people in Dawson. The growth continued and reaches a total population of 80,000 at the end of our era, 1918. Most of these numbers come from French-Canadian immigration, but some come from the immigration of other European ethnic groups such as the Greeks, Poles, Lithuanians, Italians, and Ukrainians, to name only a few. At this time in American history, the US received 20 million immigrants from Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe. There were various push factors for each of these different ethnicities. The Jewish population from Eastern Europe sought to escape the pogroms. Additionally, many Italian immigrants sought to escape the wave of natural disasters in Italy. An anonymous quote from an immigrant around this time says, quote, I came to America because I heard the streets were paved in gold. When I got here, I found out 3 things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them. End quote. Streets paved with gold. Doesn't that sound familiar? Where did we hear that before? Oh yeah. Wasn't it episode 4 with the French Canadians? As these new immigrants arrive in Dawson, they rent out the tenements and many triple-deckers that housed the new immigrants from years before. As some older immigrant groups such as the first French Canadians and the Irish opened businesses and moved up in the local economy, Some were able to afford houses in the streetcar suburbs that were served by horse-drawn streetcars. These streetcar suburbs were built on the outskirts of the triple-decker neighborhoods, and across the river in White. The increased transportation from the streetcar of the last episode lets residents live further away from the city center, letting places like White and other close surrounding lands to be more livable for those working in downtown Dawson. As White develops more than the other streetcar suburbs due to the presence of Stamford Falls Academy, the existing town center and the new small paper mill, the local Catholic parish was under great pressure to expand further than the medium-sized congregation of St. Patrick's, and a small congregation of the 20-year-old Prince of Peace. As a result, the Annunciation of the Blessed Parish created a plan to build 3 new permanent churches: St. Paul the Apostle in White, St. Anne in Dawson, and the long-awaited seat of the diocese, All Saints Cathedral. Beginning 2 years after the establishment of the diocese in 1876, a campaign to gather money to fund the 3 new churches began. Money was gathered from the Roman Catholic Church itself, the congregations of the parish, and local donations. In total, it would take 20 years to finance all 3 churches, with All Saints Cathedral taking priority. Then St. Paul the Apostle, and finally St. Anne with the least priority of all 3, as this church was planned to handle the potential of a later overflow of the parish. And finally, St. Anne with the least priority of all 3, as this church was planned to handle the potential of a later overflow in the parish. Because of this hype and excitement for this massive and grand cathedral, the $950,000 construction cost, roughly equivalent to $25 million today, was raised in a period of only 13 years. Construction of the cathedral did not wait until it had all of the estimated funds, but instead was built in steps with what funding it had in these moments. On Good Friday, 1882, the cornerstone of All Saints Cathedral is laid. While the construction on the cathedral is still ongoing, in 1889 construction begins on St. Paul the Apostle Church in White and St. Anne in 1901. 1883 sees another significant year for organized labor in Dawson, as the Knights of Labor begins. The Knights of Labor is not a labor union itself, but instead a labor federation, which sought to organize unskilled laborers. The Knights of Labor was very favorable with the Catholics during its run. At the time, statistically, if you were Catholic, you were most likely a member of the Knights of Labor as well. That's just how common it was. In 1886, the leader of the Knights of Labor traveled to the Vatican and successfully petitioned to support labor rights within the Catholic Church. Further cementing the Roman Catholic Church's support of labor rights was the 1891 publishing of Rerum Novarum, or On Labor in Capital. In this document, Pope Leo XIII supported the right of labor unionization and rebuked both socialism and unregulated capitalism. The Knights of Labor advocated for the 8-hour workday, end of child labor, end of convict labor, and end of income tax. In 1891, the main state branch of the American Federation of Labor was organized. The American Federation of Labor was formed as a response to the dissatisfaction with the Knights of Labor. They were a successful organization and lasted independently until its merger with the Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1955. The American Federation of Labor was a culmination of various skilled workers' unions, such as the Textile Workers of America, the Cigar Makers International Union, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and the Mine Workers of America Union. Like the American Federation of Labor, they all sought changes such as the implementation of the 8-hour workday, opposing the 10-hour workday that was commonplace. In 1884, Dawson sees another significant organization, the Grey Nuns, or Sœurs Grises. The Grey Nuns were, and remain today, a small collection of Roman Catholic sisterhoods. Here's an extract from the Grey Nuns of Montreal's website. Quote, "The mission of the Grey Nuns is based on the following values: solidarity with the poor, promotion of social justice, protection of the sanctity of life, especially through respect of human rights and conservation of the environment." End quote. The organization was founded in 1738 in Montreal by St. Margaret Dieuville. As the Grey Nuns expanded in 1840, they became an important provider of health care and social services in Quebec, Western and Northern Canada, and the Northern United States. Dawson is among those places who were served by the Grey Nuns, more specifically the Sisters of Hope at St. Camille. In 1887, the Sisters of Hope established the first hospital in Dawson, St. Jude Hospital. This is a French hospital in language and Catholic in practice, as it was a product of French-Canadian nuns. This hospital is not for profit, meaning that they do not profit off of patients nor pay taxes, and in return give an important service to the community, especially to impoverished patients. This hospital is open to all patients, no matter what language or religion they have. Along with the hospital, the Grey Sisters established an orphanage and a community center for the local French-Canadian population. It acted as a school, theater, place of worship when needed, and most importantly, location of community meetings for the French Canadians. Quickly after its establishment, a francophone newspaper, Le Chroniqueur, becomes a catalyst for the local French-Canadian population. Even though St. Jude had many non-francophone supporters, in 1889 the Public Tribune, the local Anglophone newspaper, reports many stories on the establishment of another hospital. Reportedly, many Protestant women and ministers from Stamford organized to build a competing hospital. It was clear that this was a response to St. Jude, and a rather anti-French one to be exact, as it directly sought to move financial aid from St. Jude's hospital to theirs. A year later, the state legislature passes a bill to allocate $50,000 for the Anglophone hospital. Le Chroniqueur reported on this story as well. The French-Canadian community organized against this measure, but to no avail as the Dawson General Hospital was founded. Both Yankee and Irish patients refused to go to St. Jude, as it was run by French-Canadian nuns. One of the concerns of the Anglophone doctors were that they were seeing women, the Grey Sisters, in the medical field. In 1887, a bill is passed to establish a normal college around Stamford under the name of Dawson State Normal College. Normal colleges were a type of post-secondary institution with a specific role in training teachers, giving the area its first post-secondary educational institution. Another improvement is that in 1890, the horse car trolleys in Dawson become electrified. An electric streetcar is cleaner and is able to go faster and further, meaning that people were able to live out further and further from the city center, and there would be less horse manure on the streets from the horse-drawn trolleys. In the next decade, we see a boom in construction along these streetcar lines in the form of streetcar suburbs. While the immigration of new residents to Dawson arrived, the Francophone population was starting to form a unique identity, even while there was still a big influx of immigrants from Quebec. Dawson, similar to the not-so-far-away Lewiston, experiences an event of acculturation of the Francophone community. My choice book for the research into French-Canadian immigrants has been Loyal but French by Marc-Paul Richard. This book outlines the entire history of French-Canadian immigrants in Lewiston from the 1850s onward to today. A part of this book explains the acculturation of French-Canadians in Lewiston, quote, To resist assimilation into U.S. society, immigrants and their descendants had to join it to some degree. Learning English, naturalization, and voting helped to advance the interests of Franco-Americans in the country of adoption. So did helping their identity as members of the working class and the Democratic Party. Intermixing with other ethnicities, notably the Irish, in Catholic institutions, including the institution of marriage, may have served the same ends. These elements all point to the evolution of the identity of Francophones. In short, Franco-Americanism in the early 20th century entailed accepting civic responsibility in the host society, learning its de facto official language, and participating in its institutions and wars, while being proud to speak the French language and to celebrate French-Canadian traditions. Like French-Canadian descendants in the late 19th century, most of Lewiston's Franco-Americans through 1920 continued to view their participation in U.S. society as a way to achieve survivance. End quote. The name of this book, Loyal but French, comes from an affirmation used by French-Canadian immigrants during parades, advertising that their culture was not incompatible with loyalty to the United States. For the 40 or so years of our era, the French-Canadian population negotiates their identity, resulting in the new identity of the Franco-American. In the first 2 decades, French-Canadians looked to apply for citizenship in order to vote and become represented in their local government. During this time, French-Canadians were decidedly on the Democratic Party side as members of the working class. The problem, however, was that the county seat was in Stamford, locally a Republican municipality. During the late 19th century, the Republican Party held an anti-immigration agenda, and as a result of Republican control in the county seat and the knowledge that Francophones would become a strong Democrat force, the county and state Republican politicians realized that they may lose their seats. In order to avoid pressure from the Republican Party, Francophones traveled to courts in Portland to process their naturalization papers. For the past 20 years, during the parades on St. Jean-Baptiste Day, the Francophone population declared their intentions to be American, but stay French in line with la survivance. Loyal but French. The parades would be lined with flags of the United States and of France to represent their language. If I must condense the winding road from French-Canadian to Franco-American, the overarching reason for the acculturation of French-Canadians is the push to anglicize. While Franco-Americans negotiated their identity, we also see a rise in Franco-American organizations like we saw earlier last episode with the Ligue Champlain, who has continually been at the forefront of Franco-America in Dawson. We also see a snowshoeing club, more Franco-American fraternal organizations, and a Caisse Populaire, the credit union. Credit unions are distinct from banks. They operate with the members as essentially the owners of the institutions. Each member is a shareholder. They're also not-for-profit, meaning that what the bank makes on interest from loans matches what they pay for operating costs. The first credit union was established in the mid-19th century Germany by a man named Hermann Schulz. These first German credit unions were very successful, and by 1912, this first credit union had over 640,000 members. The first credit union in North America was founded in 1900 Quebec as the Caisse Populaire de Lévis, now the Desjardins Group, which in 2017 had an asset evaluation of 275 billion Canadian dollars. Then, the first ever credit union in the United States, St. Mary's Bank, was founded in 1908 in Manchester, New Hampshire for the Franco-American community, of which the establishment of this bank was aided by the founder of the Caisse Populaire de Lévis. The first credit union in Dawson was founded in 1912 under the name Le Caisse Populaire Sainte-Croix. This credit union is one of the foremost Franco-American institutions in Dawson, providing banking aid to the mill workers. In 1903, Dawson applied for a Carnegie Library grant to build a public library. In order to get a Carnegie grant from the businessman Andrew Carnegie, the local government must demonstrate the need for a public library, the building site, the ability to pay staff and maintain the library, while drawing solely from the public funds to run the library instead of donations, provide 10% of the construction costs annually, and to provide a free service to all. In 1905, the Dawson Public Library opened its doors. Along with the new public library, services in Dawson grew in the early 20th century. In 1911, Dawson was a part of a brand new interurban network in western and central Maine, connecting Dawson directly to Portland. These interurbans were individually powered electric train cars, and they ran faster than most highway speed limits today. Each interurban contained a smoking room with leather seats. With all the good things happening around Dawson in this era, there was light shedding on horrible things. In 1913, renowned photographer Lewis Hine arrives in Dawson to photograph child labor in the mills. Child labor was very common in mills not only in Dawson but also around the United States at this time, with children working as young as 8 years old. The conditions these children worked in were appalling, and accidents were not uncommon and sometimes resulted in death. In the mills, child laborers were in demand as their small hands would be able to get into parts of the machinery that adult hands could not. It was not until 1924 that a permanent amendment to the Constitution was passed allowing the regulation of child labor, which had been previously attempted but struck down to the United States Supreme Court. The 1920s will see many other laws pass. Some of these brought out xenophobia that would create a rift in society. watching or listening to the 6th episode of Dawson. If you like this, please consider subscribing so you can be the first to know when episode 7 drops, and leave a like to show your positive reinforcement. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle unnamedwithmatt, and if you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com.